What's up, YouTube? It's Nerdy, and welcome back to the Transmissions Draft League. I got another pre-Season 4 draft video coming for you, where today we are going to be talking about hidden gems. Today, I thought it would be interesting. I asked in the Discord what things you guys would be interested in, and so for today, we are talking about Pokemon who are worth only single-digit points, but are still worth considering for your draft plan. Now, for this, I tried to limit myself to 2 Pokemon per point category, and with those 2 points, 2 Pokemon rather, I decided to pick 1 support Pokemon and 1 damage dealing Pokemon from every category. Now, looking lower down, you're more likely to find better value for your support Pokemon rather than your damage dealing Pokemon, but there is still a lot of very valuable Pokemon in both categories, and for that reason I wanted to highlight a little bit of both. So we got a long list to get through here, so let's get into it without further ado. And the first one up we have is Iron Leaves. Now Iron Leaves is traditionally one of the worst Paradox Pokemon, right alongside things like Slitherwing and Iron Thorns. However, in my opinion, Iron Leaves is one of the Pokemon that has the most potential for a cheap Pokemon. Now, Grass and Psychic is not a very good type, so Iron Leaves is one of those Pokemon where if you're committed to it, it's probably because you're willing to spend Terra on it. But this Pokemon actually has really good stats. If you give this thing a good defensive typing, 130 is really good physical attack, and then 90, 88, and 108 are pretty respectable bulk numbers, and 104 is a really nice speed stat to be at, where it outspeeds things such as Landorus Incarnate, and obviously all of our base 100s. But yeah, it also has the benefit of obviously being able to boost one of its stats with that Quark Drive boost, and it works really well in both electric and psychic terrain, but I honestly don't think it's reliant on either of those 2 things. It just functions really well in those specific scenarios. Now, why you should consider this Pokemon is not just because it's a great offensive Pokemon, but it has a pretty deep move pool. As you can see, it gets pretty good coverage and high base power coverage, which is really what you should be looking for if you are going to grab something based on its coverage moves. You really can only get away with high base power coverage moves. So for example, this Pokemon gets Close Combat. Leaf Blade is a stab move with a high crit rate, so you can get away with that. Mega Horn, obviously really solid with a chance to miss, and then Psyblade being its signature move, getting that boost in electric terrain. But this Pokemon does also get access to things like Wild Charge, so overall pretty solid coverage there. But this Pokemon also gets a lot of other really valuable moves, such as, for example, Sword Stance and Taunt. Those 2 things obviously making it a little bit more threatening to a little bit more defensive or slow playing teams. But then it also gets access to a wide plethora of supporting moves that do also make it nice to have on any given team. Those being, of course, Quick Guard, Imprison for taking down teams that have these specific moves that you are trying to avoid. And then it can also set up terrain for itself, so not a Pokemon that you can ignore. But also this Pokemon does get Coaching. Another really solid supporting move that does go underappreciated on a lot of Pokemon. So all in all, this is a threatening Pokemon that can work on a multitude of teams. The best use case for this Pokemon is a team that can also fit electric terrain, whether that be manual or set up by Pincurchin. But this Pokemon also does have a fair amount of supporting moves that do make it valuable to a multitude of teams. Next up, I have Tinkaton. Now, Tinkaton is definitely a support Pokemon through and through. This Pokemon has, as you can tell based on what we just are comparing it to, a lot worse stats. It's not that these stats are bad, especially on a very good typing such as Fairy and Steel, but they do have some restrictions for sure. Um, Now, Tinkaton does also have a lot of really valuable um, support moves, which is why we are going to be talking about it here. Um, like we said with Iron Leaves, this Pokemon also has really respectable bulk. Like we said, with that really good typing, that accentuates it a little bit further. And then 95 speed is a good spot to be at. You do underspeed a lot of valuable targets, but 95 is still keeping you at a reasonable pace to at least force your opponent to need to invest in their speed in order to outspeed you. Now, like I said, this Pokemon gets a ton of really valuable support moves, but it also gets really high base power moves, which does allow it to not be a complete sitting duck if your opponent were to ignore it. Mainly its signature move of Gigaton Hammer, which does kind of make up for the fact that it has a very low to mediocre attacking stat. This Pokemon does also get decent coverage in terms of Ice Hammer and Knockoff, and then of course your Stab Play Rough. But all in all, this Pokemon's not really going to be doing damage unless it's hitting Gigaton Hammers. That being said, this Pokemon, like I said, is going to be used for its support capabilities, in where it learns Encore, Fake Out, Fake Tears, as well as things like Reflect. It does not get it does get Light Screen as well, but it also gets Skill Swap. So this is another really interesting thing about this Pokemon, is that it does get Mold Breaker, so you can do things like Mold Breaker Earthquake, giving your Mold Breaker to your partner, but it also gets something like Thunder Wave. Thunder Wave gives this Pokemon the ability to paralyze things that, for example, have the Volt Absorb ability, or the immunity to electric type attacks. Pretty niche and not really going to come up in very many scenarios, but interesting to talk about nonetheless. And then aside from that, this Pokemon doesn't really have too much that it does outside of something like Metal Sound, being able to lower that special defense. Obviously, we talked about Fake Tears as being something that it can actually do. Faint is actually really nice at breaking protects. And then this Pokemon does also get Quash, so if you are in a scenario where you are faster than your opponent, Quash does give you a chance to follow up with a bit of a slower Pokemon. And then aside from that, it's just a Pokemon with a good typing, decently deep move pool that provides quite a bit to a team. And I definitely think you should consider Tinkaton on your team. This Pokemon is very valuable, but just be aware that as a support Pokemon, it's really only going to be providing value to a team in terms of damage if it's able to use its signature move. Next up, we are moving on to the 8-point category with Araquanid. So Araquanid is a Pokemon that has pretty good stats in some places, really bad stats in other places. Overall bulk for this Pokemon is okay. The main thing being that this Pokemon has a really decent special defense, meaning that it can actually take those hits pretty well. But this is a slow Pokemon. With only 42 speed, this is probably going to be a Trick Room Pokemon or a support Pokemon. But you'll be happy to know that this Pokemon is meant to be used offensively because of this ability, Water Bubble. This gives its water type attacks a doubled base power, which does also stack with Terra, and also Rain. So this allows you to hit things really, really hard with your stab liquidations, boosted further by Water Bubble, Terra Water, and the Rain. Very few things take that very well. And like we said, this Pokemon is slow, so it does function the best on Trick Room teams, but it's not completely dead in the water outside of Trick Room. This Pokemon does also get some stall tactics that do make it interesting, such as Icy Wind and Infestation, but it does also get some attack lowering options such as Lunge and Chilling Water. And then on top of that, it does get some amount of setup in terms of Iron Defense. Unfortunately, no Body Press to make use of that. However, this Pokemon does also get Wide Guard, which is one of the best things about Araquanid, is that it does provide you that protection from spread moves. Oftentimes, it's kind of the fourth move you add to your Araquanid, but a very valuable move nonetheless. Aside from that, Araquanid is just providing a ton of water type damage. And to a team that is either looking for a Trick Room sweeper or looking for specifically water type damage, Araquanid does provide a lot of value there. And that is kind of just all that you can expect from a Pokemon to fill a role at this point. Remember, we are talking about lower tier Pokemon, so you're not necessarily looking for the most powerful Pokemon, but you are looking for a Pokemon that fits specific roles on your team or that hit a exact threshold that you're looking for. So if you're looking for either a good Wide Guard Pokemon that also provides damage, or if you're looking for just a really solid Trick Room attacker, Araquanid is your guy. Also at 8 points, we have Toedscruel. Toedscruel is a very interesting Pokemon because it is kind of a confused Pokemon. Now, I believe that Toedscruel doesn't need Wheezing, but this is a Pokemon that potentially you could pair with another relatively cheap Pokemon in Wheezing at 12 points, being able to negate its ability. But like I said, not super necessary. Now, Ground and Grass is not a great typing, but it does kind of provide you with some interesting resistances. And Ground and Grass is actually not that bad offensively, but of course you're using this Pokemon for its support capabilities. Now, this Pokemon, of course, gets some of the most annoying support moves in the game. Of course, Light Screen and Reflect are always really nice. Rage Powder is always a pain in the butt if you are not prepared. But the main reason we talk about this Pokemon is, of course, Spore. Now, we talk about this because Mycelium Might does force their moves to go last in their priority bracket if they are a status move, but it does ignore Pokemon's abilities. So this allows Toedscruel to actually use Spore against Pokemon that have something like Overcoat at the cost of forcing you to go after them. This is not the detriment that you may think it is, though. Oftentimes, Spore is useful at going last because it guarantees you at least one turn where this Pokemon cannot act. If you put a Pokemon to sleep before it moves, it then has a chance to wake up on the very next turn. So, depending on the matchup or your willingness to spend a Terra on Toedscruel, it can live a hit, put something to sleep, and guarantee you a free move next turn. Or if you're willing to spend the points on something like Wheezing, it does also give you the option of instantaneously putting something to sleep with a very respectable base speed of 100. Now, like I said, this thing's not dead in the water offensively. It gets pretty decent coverage moves across the board, but Earth Power and Energy Ball do tend to get it done, as well as, like we said, the annoying support moves that this thing does provide. Now, funnily enough, this Pokemon does also provide Trick Room to a team. Not really something that you always expect out of this Pokemon, but it does get a pretty deep move pool. And although it's not the most impactful Pokemon, Spore is a very valuable tool when you do have it, and the amount of pressure that it can put on your opponent, not just during the game, but in team building, does kind of give your team a whole lot of space that it wouldn't have had otherwise, on top of the fact that it can use redirection and a couple of other support moves that are still also very valuable. So keep an eye out for Toedscruel in your draft plans. Next up at 7 points, I got Honchkrow. Now, a lot of you will be familiar with the fact that Murkrow, the pre-evolution of Honchkrow, is actually worth nearly double, if not more than double, points than Honchkrow is here. So why are we mentioning it here? Well, Honchkrow actually has a very confused base stats. This Pokemon is capable of being a mixed attacker, but it also has a really high HP stat with low defenses, meaning that it's kind of frail, kind of not, and then a very mid-speed tier. This kind of leaves Honchkrow in a very confused place. However, there are a couple of things that I would like to highlight about Honchkrow. The first one being, of course, Super Luck. Now, this increases your critical hit rate and leaves you only 2 stages of increased critical hit rate from getting guaranteed crits. And one way you can do that is by using the item scope lens and then using high critical hit ratio moves such as Night Slash. Yep, this is Urshifu Single Strike at home. You get free Dark type critical hits for only 7 points on a much worse Pokemon that is slower, but you do also get a couple of other things. Honchkrow does get all of the same moves that Murkrow gets, meaning that it does have a pretty deep support move pool, but obviously it doesn't make as good use of them. You do still get access to Haze, Icy Wind, things such as Foul Play, Snarl, but you also get things like Perish Song, which is really good on specific teams or strategies. Taunt and Tailwind are obviously really good. You get a very high critical hit rate Sucker Punch as well, which is very valuable. This is something that Urshifu cannot match. And then you also get things like Feather Dance and Quash, similar to what Murkrow gets. And yeah, basically it's just a lot of value for a Pokemon that you don't necessarily expect to be doing a whole lot. I like this Pokemon a lot just because I do think it's very funny that a Pokemon like Honchkrow can get guaranteed crits. And 125 is actually a very respectful attack stat to have those guaranteed crits coming from. So it can be actually quite threatening offensively in the correct matchup. Like I said though, with a lot of these offensive Pokemon at lower tiers, you have to be willing to spend your Terra on them, otherwise they're just not worth it. So keep that in mind when you are building your draft plans. Next up, I have Paldean Tauros. This is a pretty decent support Pokemon that also has some offensive presence. This is a pure fighting type, so a little bit worse defensive typing than the alternative Tauros forms, but you still get the same great base stat total attached to Intimidate. 70, 105, and 70. 75, 105, and 70 is pretty respectable. And then 110 does also give you a good attacking stat that makes you still threatening. And of course, 100 speed does allow you to continue to be impactful. Now, this Pokemon also gets pretty good coverage moves, as well as some setup opportunities. But in my opinion, what you're really using this Pokemon for is for a very fast physical attacker that can hopefully come in relatively frequently to lock down Pokemon with some Intimidates. Other than that, I don't really see too much value out of this Pokemon aside from, like we said, really valuable fighting type damage attached to Intimidate. Now, there are Pokemon that are a little bit more expensive than Tauros that do this, but for my money, Tauros is actually a pretty good candidate for a low tier pick because of those specific qualities. Now I am going to start speeding up a little bit more because there will be less to talk about for the Pokemon going forward. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in either the Discord or the comments. But let's keep moving along. Moving on to 6 points, we have a support category Pokemon of Spiritomb. This Pokemon overall has pretty good stats with a low HP stat, so it has the unfortunate ghost type problem of having good defenses with a low HP stat and not a whole lot of recovery. But obviously this is a Trick Room Pokemon. You are using this Pokemon to set up Trick Room, support your team, and hopefully get through 4 turns of Trick Room while dealing a ton of damage. Pretty good support move pool. Like we said, Ally Switch is also one of the most annoying moves in the game to go up against. In my opinion, even harder to deal with than things like Spore. But we haven't really seen it just yet, so I do believe that Ally Switch at some point is going to be making an impact. Overall, Good support Pokemon that generally gives your team a really cheap option for Trick Room, or a cheap way to stop Trick Room, as it does learn Imprison as well as a pretty decent support move pool. Next up, we have Emboar. Now, this is my favorite starter Pokemon of all time, which is part of the reason why it is on this list, but it is also a really decent Trick Room attacker. Like we talked about, it is a Pokemon you're probably going to have to spend your Terra on or invest really heavily into for your strategy, but with Reckless and 123 attack, as well as really high base power moves such as Close Combat and Flare Blitz, this Pokemon actually does deal a ton of damage to your opponent, and like I said, if you're willing to spend an offensive Terra on this Pokemon, it can be quite a nightmare for your opponent to deal with. Outside of that though, not a whole lot that this Pokemon offers. Of course it does offer coaching, but outside of that, this Pokemon is really just here to deal out the damage, and occasionally you might have a really good type matchup where this Pokemon can spread status such as Will-O-Wisp and Yawn. Outside of that though, this Pokemon is known for dealing damage for a reason, and that is because it's a reckless damage dealer. Next up at 5 points, I have a Lowland Persian. This Pokemon is deceptively good. 115 speed is really good and allows you to be really disruptive for your opponent. But this Pokemon also has deceptive base stats. On the surface, no good attacking stat or defensive stat until you realize that this Pokemon has Fur Coat, which actually doubles your defensive stat, putting it in the same realm as something like Torkoal. So this Pokemon actually does take physical hits very well. On top of that, insanely deep move pool. This Pokemon gets basically every support move that you would ever want out of it. It gets Fake Out, it gets Parting Shot, it gets Taunt. It also gets something interesting that you will know if you saw Season 2. It gets Switcheroo, something really fun to use on a very fast Pokemon. Being able to switch something like an eject button onto your opponent makes this Pokemon really interesting to use. But of course, like we talked about, this thing also gets Squash, something like Screech, just a way to like really start rolling through your strategy. And a Lowland Persian is one of those support Pokemon that does give you a lot of space to operate. On top of that, this is a support Pokemon that doesn't actually lack damage output because it does learn Stab Foul Play. Now, coming off of Stab does actually matter for a move like Foul Play because it does use your opponent's attack during damage calculation. And that does mean that despite not having a good attacking stat, a Lowland Persian actually can threaten quite a few Pokemon, especially those whom this Pokemon wants to go up against because of your Fur Coat ability. So definitely worth considering there. Next up, I got Revavroom, one of the new Pokemon introduced, and in my opinion, kind of just missed the mark for how good this Pokemon actually could be. Decent attacking stat with very mid stats across the board elsewhere, with a really low special defense that does kind of let this thing down. But two really solid abilities, especially for VGC, and on top of that, pretty solid move pool. Of course, you're looking at your physical attacks, but this thing also gets good support moves such as Haze. But the big thing to really focus on for this Pokemon, in my opinion, is Shift Gear. This is a Dragon Dance on steroids, and any Pokemon that can use it that is any amount viable is gonna be dangerous. And the fact that this Pokemon is worth only 5 points just kind of shows that it is only slightly missing the mark. If it had just a little bit more, in my opinion, this Pokemon would be very, very tough to handle. So definitely consider it on your team. Next up, I have Braviary Hisui, another Pokemon that has one good stat and a good ability that makes it just a little bit off the cusp of viability. This Pokemon does get Sheer Force, which does allow it to use really powerful moves, and in my opinion, on the correct team, will make very good use of those things. Of course, when I talk about this Pokemon, I think about using its two stabs. being both Expanding Force and Hurricane. So in my opinion, the best way, and really the only way to use Braviary Sui is either on Rain or Psychic Terrain teams, or a combination of both. And this allows you to really make use of that Sheer Force ability, spamming really high base power moves that also give you a ton of offensive pressure. Now, like we talked about with the other Pokemon, you really have to be willing to spend your Taro on Braviary Sui because this is a flying type Pokemon. That means that it cannot actually benefit from Psychic Terrain unless you get rid of its flying typing and therefore make Expanding Force an actual threat. Now, this Pokemon, in my opinion, is very worth it. 112 is a respectable special attack stat, and when that gets a Life Orb and Sheer Force boost, even your coverage moves that have middling base power become very threatening. Next up, we have Yanmega. This is, in my opinion, a support Pokemon, but with a decent special attack stat. Hopefully you can find a matchup where it doesn't get walled by everything, and as long as you are able to hit with your stabs, in my opinion, this Pokemon can be a little bit threatening offensively. Now, of course, the main draw with this Pokemon is Speed Boost and being able to set Tailwind up for your team. Outside of that, this Pokemon doesn't really do too much for a team. A couple of support moves across the board. Struggle Bug, obviously one that I want to point out here as an alternative to Snarl. On a fast Pokemon, obviously really nice. It does allow your team to kind of get a little bit more breathing room while also putting on the pressure for your opponent because you are able to set up that Tailwind. And then, like we said, not a complete sitting duck, although you do really want to be able to use your stabs. So in the case where Bug and Flying is not a good offensive type, you do fall short there. Next up for 3 points, I have Passimian. Again, a Pokemon that feels like it's really close, but just not quite there. This Pokemon gets Defiant, which is the main reason why I wanted to bring it up. Any team that is very physical attack reliant, in my opinion, needs a way to deter Intimidate or the ability to lower stats. And for that reason, Passimian is a decent low tier choice to add to a team, with the added benefit of something that I did last season of being able to combo Acrobatics with something like the Adrenaline Orb and Defiant. Essentially, it gives you a Dragon Dance boost on top of a 110 base power flying type move, which you can then combo with Terra Flying, and that makes this Pokemon really threatening. Now, that does rely on your opponent intimidating you, but very decent Pokemon overall after that. Of course, we talked about Coaching is a very good support move, and then Taunt is not bad, especially on a Pokemon of a decent speed stat. And looking further down, you get a couple of really interesting moves such as Quick Guard there, and Upper Hand, obviously a really nice move to have as well because priority can be a problem for certain teams, but for the most part, this Pokemon is really there to patch up a hole on a team. Next up, we have Poltergeist. We are starting to get into the category where support Pokemon will not be able to do anything besides the support, but what Poltergeist provides is actually really valuable. Now, this Pokemon gets, of course, Life Dew and Rage Powder, along with a couple of other support moves, like we talked about with Foul Play. Really nice to have on a support Pokemon, meaning that you don't actually have to invest in those attacking stats. But it also gets Trick Room, deceptively good at actually setting up Trick Room because it does have a decent bulk after Eviolite. Of course, it's not going to be anything to scream about, but Ghost and Grass is okay defensive typing and can provide your team with a lot of space. But the main reason you are getting this is because, of course, Hospitality, giving you that free heal on switch in. A support Pokemon through and through for 3 points. Honestly, kind of a value, especially for a team lacking redirection. I would look at adding Poltergeist to your draft strategy. Now we are at the final tier. So for 2 points, I have Beartic. Beartic is a Pokemon that has both the ability to work in rain or snow, and it's really going to need that because as a offensive ice type, it is slow. And that means that it needs to be able to boost its speed, whether that be through Tailwind or through its ability to boost its own speed. But once you get there, 130 is a really good attacking stat, and like we talked about with a lot of other Pokemon, it has high base power coverage moves. So we talk about things such as Earthquake, or even if you're willing to use a loaded dice, Icicle Spear is probably your best stab move. And then we are talking about just generally solid coverage moves. You do have a couple of support moves such as Snarl and Taunt, but outside of that, you're really just looking at a Pokemon with a high attacking stat that is hopefully going to provide a little bit of a change up for your team. Hopefully you're not centering a game plan around a 2-point Pokemon, but if it happens to come up, then it comes up. So yeah, Beartic, a good offensive 2-point Pokemon you should consider adding to your team. And finally, a support Pokemon in the 2-point category is Magby. Yeah, this baby Pokemon actually is worth adding to your team, and that is because with the Eviolite, like we talked about with Poltegeist, not bad, and then it also gets 83 base speed, which does mean that it can contribute to a battle with a lot of its other support moves, but the main one you're going to be focusing on here is, of course, Follow Me. Follow Me is arguably the best move in VGC, gives your team a ton of space to do what it needs to do, and Magby is really good at that. Now the other thing that I did want to mention about Magby is because it has such low attacking stats, it also can do some interesting things by attacking your partner. So this is things like Lava Plume for something that is immune to fire type damage, whether that be through a Flash Fire Pokemon or something like Darkspawn that gets Will Baked Body. Lava Plume could be an interesting thing that of course you can get off because of that decent speed stat. But also look at things that are non-stab such as Mach Punch in order to activate a weakness policy for your partner. Not bad. On top of that, this Pokemon does also get Will-O-Wisp, very decent support move that really lowers offensive output from opposing teams, which you're hopefully already doing with your ability to redirect attacks into yourself. But yeah, that is what I have for single digit point gems. Hopefully you found a diamond in the rough here, and hopefully you got an idea of what to look for in these lower tiered Pokemon. Hopefully you are able to find a few to round out your draft going forward. And yeah, if you have any questions, like I said, feel free to ask me in the Discord or the comment section, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.